Now, I might be a little bit late to the party when it comes to Archguns, but I wanted to cook up something really out of the ordinary, and man do we have buffs today, friends! You like that? Well, then in today's Warframe guide, I'm gonna give you a full breakdown of the entire loadout that makes this possible, all the synergies and builds for not just one, but many different Archguns, and it's just gonna be complete destruction. Big shoutouts to all our generous channel members, and now let's get right to it. Okay, first of all, this video is gonna have a bit of an unusual structure compared to my other videos, so let's quickly talk about what you're gonna see today. The first thing I want to talk about in this video is what you need to pay attention to when building Archguns in general, because modding Archguns is quite a bit different to modding any other weapon type. I try to not stretch it out too much, but I would really appreciate if you check it out, because that's what's going to establish our mindset, so to speak, for the rest of the builds. Then, after that, I'm gonna very quickly go over the, in my opinion, best Archguns in the game, because compared to other weapon types, Archguns are quite expensive and investment heavy if you want to get the most out of them. You're gonna have to install a Gravimag to even use it in normal missions, plus 2 arcane adapters, and the Forma and the Catalyst. So if you want to build an Archgun, you want to make sure that it is a good one, so I'm gonna give you my top 5. And then finally, we're going to go over the entire setup. It's going to be a big synergy between Warframe, Companion, Archguns, and everything. And I'm going to also show you different variations of that setup, depending on which of our top 5 Archguns you play with it. Let's talk about Archgun modding first, though. It is very crucial that we understand that modding Archguns is very special compared to all the other weapon types. See, one very crucial thing, and also unfortunately a limiting factor, is that Archguns, compared to other gun types, don't have access to any galvanized mods, no elementalist mods, and also no faction damage mods. I know not everybody likes faction damage, and technically this is also not too bad because you could always infuse roar, but that's still limiting for the build, and overall what I'm trying to say is these are 3 very essential mod types that we use on pretty much any build out there nowadays, and Archguns don't have that. As a consequence, what that means is that damage over time builds on Archguns, compared to other weapon types, really aren't all that good. You know, a damage over time build usually incorporates faction damage, elementalist, and 1 or even multiple galvanized mods, and with Archguns you can't do any of this, which overall also means that building for status on Archguns in general is oftentimes not all that amazing. Just to make an example, take a look at this right here. What we have here is, on the one hand, the Kuva Nukor with a heat damage over time build, and on the other side, the Larkspur Prime, which is kinda sorta the Archgun version of the Kuva Nukor, at least out of all the Archguns, the most comparable one. And at first glance, when we put them side to side, the Larkspur Prime does dispose of the enemies quite quickly, but this is not because of the damage over time, but because of the upfront damage that it deals. If we really compare only the DOTs, then the Kuva Nukor is significantly better. Now, of course I get this is only one weapon comparison and there's a lot of build variety in the game. All I'm trying to say here is that for today's video, I'm not gonna focus on any status heavy damage over time builds, but instead, we're gonna focus on what in my opinion is the biggest strength of Archguns, and that is the fat, big crit, big direct damage, and the loadout that I'm gonna show you today is going to lean very, very heavily into that. Beforehand though, would be pretty cool if you could maybe leave a quick like for the video, because the YouTube algorithm hates me at the moment, and that would help quite a lot. Big thank you for that. But alright, let's go over which Archguns we're even going to talk about in today's video. These are my personal top 5. Of course, opinions vary, but from what I've heard from most other creators, these names come up quite a lot. Not saying that all the other Archguns are trash, you could definitely make them work too, just that I think these right here are the strongest. Now, in order to save time, I'm not going to go into great detail on the weapon itself and also the builds. We're going to have that later together with the loadout. So just as a quick rundown, what we have today here would be first the Corvus Prime. This one is a really strong Archaplasmor-like Archgun, shoots 1 big energy projectile, has ludicrous crit stats, and you can either quickfire it or hold down the trigger to charge up a more powerful shot. However, I personally am not a fan of the charge shot because it knocks you back, so I usually spam the quickfire, definitely strong enough to get the job done. Number 2 would be actually 2 Archguns at the same spot. I put them together because they're very, very similar in stats and performance, and these would be the Kuva Grattler as well as the Kuva Iyengar. The Iyengar is basically a fully automatic grenade launcher, really good damage, good crit characteristics, and the Kuva Grattler has very similar stats and also works similarly, but I personally prefer the Grattler over the Iyengar because it's just a really freaking cool 4-barrel flak cannon. There's really no way you could ever have more aura than when wielding this thing. Love it. This is my personal favorite Archgun in the entire game, and as we're gonna see later, it can deal some ridiculous damage. Another great option would also be the Mausolon. I think this one even comes pre-equipped with a Gravimag if I'm not mistaken, so if you want to have one Archgun with a little bit lower investment needs, this right here would be it. It's a fast-firing, fully automatic gun with a big 300-round magazine and an alt-fire that you can charge up by getting kills, which will then deal absolutely devastating damage when unleashed. All in all, this is kind of sort of the Archgun version of the Trumna, if you know what I mean. It's a very good all-round choice. Then, one more Archgun that I want to talk about would be the Arbucep, the brand new one that came in with Noko. This one is a little bit strange in the sense that it always fires 6 homing projectiles, and each of these homing projectiles deals damage based on one of the 6 combined elements. However, you can't mod the multi-shot value of this. Instead, if you put a multi-shot mod on, it's just going to be transformed into more damage. Kinda weird, but as you're also gonna see later, we can get some ridiculous numbers out of this, and it is crazy fun to play. And then, last but not least, we have another double pack of weapons, and that would be the Larkspur Prime as well as the Cortege. Or Cortege? Is it French? Anyway, as we already saw before, the Larkspur Prime is kinda sort of the Archgun version of the Kuva Nukor, very heavy on the status, which is unfortunately not all that amazing on Archguns compared to other weapon types, but we can still get some ridiculous performance out of it because it has pretty high damage compared to normal beam weapons. And then in the same spot, we have the Cortege. I'm just gonna pretend it's French now. This one is a sort of flamethrower. It has a bit of a shorter range, pretty similar stats overall, a little bit more in terms of crit. However, I personally still prefer the Larkspur over the Cortege because of that really cool beam mechanic. So yeah, these would be the Archguns that we're gonna cook with today. So let's finally get into the full loadout that I have prepared for you, which will buff the ever-living heck out of those guns. Let's start with the Warframe. When it comes to buffing Archguns, there is of course not only one option. Frames like Harrow or Saren are always amazing when it comes to buffing any type of guns, so that goes without say. I've also seen a fun build from KnightmareFrame on Mirage. Lavos is cool too, not only because of the elemental buffing, but also because he can use his transmutation probe to give you infinite ammo. However, what we're going to talk about today is something that I haven't really seen anyone talk about before, and that would be Archgun buffing Protea. Might sound crazy, but here's what I mean. First of all, Protea of course has Dispensary, giving you infinite energy and, most important, universal ammo, which means your Archguns are never gonna run dry. Yes, of course, this is her helmet ability, and you could technically put it on any other Warframe to make that Warframe a better Archgun wielder too, which I would also highly recommend if you want to do that. But there is much more that Protea has to offer that's gonna come in very, very handy with Archguns. For example, her first ability, Grenade Fan, which gives us constant access to overshields. Now, why is that so important? I'm gonna go into that later when we talk about the Archgun builds. For the time being, just keep it in mind, having overshields is gonna be very beneficial for Archguns. Another thing that Protea has is her Blaze Artillery. This is an ability that can inflict heat status effects. Also here, I'm gonna explain why that is important in just a minute, just keep it in mind for the time being. And then finally, as a helmet ability, we infuse Cyto 9's Evade over our fourth ability, which will allow us to go constantly invisible, and being invisible, that's gonna come in clutch when running Archguns. So, quick recap, Dispensary for the ammo, Grenade Fan for the overshields, Blaze Artillery to inflict heat, and then Evade to become invisible. All of these will be very important in just a minute. Before we go into the Protea build though, let's quickly talk about our companion too. Here we go with either Worm Prime or Nautilus Prime, which one of these doesn't really matter all too much. these are the only sentinels that can be modded to over 1200 shields, and that is required to be able to use Reinforced Bond, which is a great mod because it gives us 60% free fire rate. As a companion weapon, we either use the Volcax, the Volklock, or the laser rifle. All of these have enough base crit chance to be modded to over 50% crit chance when using critical delay, and that's something we need to do for the second bond mod we're going to use, called Tenacious Bond. This gives us a final 1.2 times crit damage multiplier if our crit chance is over 50%. With other Sentinel weapons, this isn't really possible, maybe with the Verglass Prime if you have a crit chance Riven, but for the sake of simplicity, go with the Volcax, Volklock, or the laser rifle. Now, in this video, I personally decided to go for a Nautilus Prime. This right here would be the full build, but remind you, most of this here is not mandatory. The only two mods that we really want to have is Reinforced Bond for the fire rate, as well as Tenacious Bond for the crit damage. And of course, in order to get the 1200 shields we need for Reinforced Bond, we have to go with Calculated Redirection, which will get our shields to over 1200 and then activate this mod. Also going to give you a quick look at my Volcax build right here. Most of this here is not necessary. The only thing we literally need for the Archgun focused build is critical delay. The rest of the stuff is, mods that I usually use for other weapon buffing setups, which then in turn will activate Tenacious Bond here that gives us more crit damage. That would be our companion. Let's next take a look at the star of the show. That would be our Protea and the build that I have on her, starting out with the Archon shards. These right here aren't all that special. All I'm doing is go for more maximum energy, so I don't have to mod for it, effectively freeing up one mod slot in the build, and then 2 shards for casting speed, because it is pretty nice and convenient. But to make it very clear, you do not have to copy these shards to make the build that I'm going to show you now work. If you wanted to, you could also leave all the shards out completely and it wouldn't really change all too much. This right here would be it, and I know it looks incredibly crazy, but trust me, I'm going somewhere with this. Now, usually on a normal Protea, you would focus on ability strength and duration. Strength to make your Blaze Artillery deal more damage and to, buff your other abilities in general, and duration to keep your Blaze Artillery and your buffs up for longer. But because this build right here is meant to buff up our arc guns, we don't really care about strength all that much. We need our Blaze Artillery to inflict heat, that's what we talked about earlier, but we don't need it to deal damage, and because of the fact that we are invisible, we also don't need to get a ton of shields and defenses from our first ability, so strength is sort of a bit of our dump stat. Instead, what I did is focus completely on duration, with Prime Continuity, Narrow-Minded, Augur Message, and Constitution. This is great because it means we can keep our invisibility from evade up pretty comfortably, and also our Blaze Artillery is going to be on the field for 9 seconds, which is going to make the whole build much more convenient to play. But because we have Narrow-Minded and this reduces our ability range, I went for Overextended to compensate for the loss in range, otherwise our Blaze Artillery might just not find any targets. And because I didn't want to go negative on strength, because there's still a bit of extra pickup chance that this gives us from a dispensary, I went for Archon Intensify. This will give us a total of 60% ability strength, because Cydo9's Evade gives us health per kill, so that then triggers the substat of Archon Intensify, ending us up at a total of 100% ability strength in the mission. Now, the rest is pretty self-explanatory. Equilibrium to be able to turn the health pickups from Dispensary into tons of energy, so we never have to worry about that. Prime Surefooted in the Exilus so we don't get knocked down. And in the Aura, I went for Combat Discipline. This, on the one hand, has to do with Archon Intensify, damaging ourselves so that we can then use our Cydo9 ability to heal us and trigger Archon Intensify. But also, on some of the build variations later, we're gonna use Arcane Avenger to gain crit chance, and that of course also only works if we take damage. That's why we need Combat Discipline. Yes, I am aware Arcane Avenger also triggers on shield damage, but remember, this is an invisible build, so without Combat Discipline, you're not gonna take consistent damage, and overall this is just the most comfortable way to play this. And then in the final mod slot right here, this is sort of the flex slot. We don't really have anything more we need here. If you don't have Archon shards for maximum energy, this is where you would put in Flow. If you don't have Archon shards for casting speed, this is where you would put Natural Talent. If you wanted to have a little teensy tiny bit more duration, you could slot in Naira's Hatred. This gives you another 15% on top, but I think that's not really making much of a difference anymore, which is why I went for Repair Dispensary. This one can reduce the downtime of our companion if that ever gets taken out, which is very nice because we rely on our companion to help us with the buffs, so that's what I decided to go for here. As I said, this one is the flex slot, you could go for anything else here. Now, you might be wondering, why didn't I show the arcanes? And this is pretty simple, because the choice of arcanes that we put on our Protea completely comes down to which Archgun we want to play with her. So what we're going to do now is, we're going to go over our top 5 Archguns that I previously mentioned, and then for each one of those, I'm going to tell you which Protea arcanes you need to put on this build to get the most out of that individual Archgun. Let's get started. Alright, so I have divided our Archgun list from previously into 2 sections. One of them would be Archguns that have good critical stats, and one of them is for Archguns that don't have innate good critical stats, where we need to get a little bit more creative to get the crit onto the Archgun. Let's take a look at the crit Archguns first. And on our Protea, when playing these Archguns, we're gonna go for Arcane Hotshot as well as Arcane Crepuscular. Arcane Hotshot gives us 6% weapon critical chance whenever an ability inflicts heat status effect, stacking up to 50 times, meaning you can get plus 300% crit chance for the Archgun out of this arcane alone. That's, by the way, also why we really want to have our Blaze Artillery. That's going to be our ability that inflicts the heat to trigger Arcane Hotshot. And then Arcane Crepuscular, because regardless of how much crit damage the Archgun has, this one will just give us a flat 3x on top. Only requirement for this is you need to be invisible, which is also the reason that we have Evade from Side 09 on Protea. Now, as for the Archguns themselves, let's start out with the Kuva Grattler. Again, as I said at the beginning of the video, I'm not going to focus on any status-heavy damage over time builds. Everything you're seeing in this video is just going to be flat, direct damage with a lot of crit, and this is the example build that I used here. On my Kuva Grattler, I'm going to go for Corrosive and Heat. This is meant to be usually against Grineer. If you go against any other enemy faction, of course you would swap around the elemental mods. And then a whole lot of crit with critical focus, giving us crit chance and damage. Hollowed bullets for even more crit damage, and then usually, when you go for crit, you would go for Parallax Scope, giving us plus 100% crit chance. However, given the fact that we already have plus 300% from Arcane Hotshot from our Protea, and we're also going to go for Cascadia Overcharge, giving us another 300% crit chance, that means the plus 100 from Parallax Scope is not going to make much of a difference anymore, which is why I decided to rather go for more elemental damage. By the way, Cascadia Overcharge, that's also the reason why Protea is so good with her constant overshields from her first ability, so Cascadia Overcharge is a really powerful source of crit chance for these builds. As for the damage part, we're going to go with Primed Rubedoline Barrel for the base damage, also Primed Deadly Efficiency, which gives us another 220% base damage on top of that, and then Primed Dual Rounds for the multi-shot, and even more base damage from Primary Merciless. Nice side effect, also gives us a little bit of reload speed. Now, I know what you might think. Usually, it is pretty darn dumb to double or even triple stack the same type of mod, like we did here. But remember what we said at the beginning of the video, building for status damage over time isn't really all that viable on Archguns, meaning we have much more free space on the build to work with, and that means double and triple stacking more damage is actually a viable tactic on Archguns. So yeah, this would be the Kuva Grattler build in combination with our Protea. Let's take a look at the next Archgun, that would be the Mausolon, and as you will see, this build looks pretty darn similar. Also here, Cascadia Overcharge for the crit chance, Primary Deadhead this time for the crit damage. You could go for Merciless if you prefer that. I just went for Deadhead for the headshot multiplier. And then also what we have here is a corrosive heat build. Heat is innately on the weapon this time, so we don't need to mod for it. Only main difference on this one is we don't use prime deadly efficiency here because this only triggers when reloaded from empty, and the Mausolon has a 300 round magazine, so we're not really gonna reload it all that much. That means this one here will not really trigger. And because I didn't really know what else to put on, I just went for parallax scope, even though it's kind of a waste. You could maybe replace it with an elemental mod if you wanted to. And then the final crit Archgun of today, that will be the Corvus Prime. This one hits like an absolute freaking truck. It has so much base crit chance that modding for parallax scope becomes a little bit tempting, which is also why I did that. But also here, we have a corrosive heat setup again. You don't reload this one in practical gameplay all too often, so I didn't really want to bother with prime deadly efficiency. That's the overall build. You know, all of these three builds work relatively similar, benefiting not only from the arcanes here, but also from Protea with Arcane Hotshot and Arcane Crepuscular. That would be the first class of Archguns, the crit Archguns. Now let's come to the second class. These are the Archguns that don't really have good crit characteristics to begin with, and that would be the Larkspur as well as the Arbucep. For these two, we're also going to have Arcane Crepuscular on our Protea, but because these Archguns don't have that much of a high base crit chance, we don't go for Arcane Hotshot with them, but instead for Arcane Avenger. This just gives us flat crit chance and therefore doesn't care about the base crit chance of the weapon. And for the Archgun builds, here I want to start out with the Larkspur. Overall, the build doesn't look all too different than the previous one. Only important thing with a Larkspur is definitely go for Sabbat rounds, because this will make it that your main beam goes through multiple enemies at the same time, and each enemy will then spawn its own tendrils that latch onto nearby enemies, giving you a much crazier AoE capability. It's a really good mod, never play the Larkspur without it. But the rest again is our standard corrosive heat focus. In the secondary arcane slot, we go for Enervate, because this, similar to Arcane Avenger, is also a flat crit chance bonus, so it doesn't care about the low base crit chance that we have. It's gonna get us really nice and high with those crit numbers. And for the primary arcane, I again went for Merciless for more base damage. I have seen a lot of players say they like primary Crux on the Larkspur, which makes sense because it gives you a lot of status chance on this really status heavy weapon. But then again, as we initially said, I'm not a fan of building for status on Archguns at all, because Archgun status builds are just inferior to normal weapon status builds. And the last Archgun that I have on the list for today would be the Arbucep. This build though is a little bit different than the other ones, because here, even though I also go for Enervate for the crit chance, in the primary arcane, I don't go for base damage, but instead I go for primary Frostbite. But because the Arbucep can't do multi-shot, that means the multi-shot stat from primary Frostbite is just going to be more damage for me. And overall, if you run the numbers, then having this one here over primary Merciless is a teensy tiny little bit stronger, which is why I went for it. But because it only triggers on cold status effects, that means I didn't mod for corrosive heat, but instead for corrosive cold. That is the full build that you're seeing right here. And very important, for the Arbucep, more than for any other Archgun on today's list, I would really highly recommend going for prime deadly efficiency, because the Arbucep has to be reloaded after like 4 trigger pulls, so you're gonna have this thing up constantly. It's gonna be a really nice damage bonus. Oh, and just by the way, 2 tips that I definitely need to give you with the Arbucep and the Larkspur is, remember how we have Cyto 9's invisibility skill, and we have to get headshot kills in order to keep the duration up? Well, with the Arbucep, this is actually pretty easy, because the missiles that it fires are somewhat homing, so if you shoot them a little bit over the enemy's heads, then you're gonna get a lot of automatic headshots with it. With the Larkspur though, it's a little bit more difficult, because this beam kinda sorta has the tendency to want to latch on to the enemy's bodies instead of the heads, and the fact that the damage numbers just clutter the screen like crazy doesn't help with this. So when playing the Larkspur, I would highly recommend switching off the damage numbers entirely and purposely aiming at enemies' heads. Then you're also going to get enough headshots to keep the invisibility up, but with damage numbers on, it's going to be very difficult to see what you're actually aiming at. And if you want to see even crazier crit setups, then check out this video right here with 2 broken strong new builds for Harrow and Kalervo. Another massive shoutout to Niels V, Demon Lord Cell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nos Linux Gaming, Turtlepeer, Ondakaneo2, Skylar Bowser, Mihawky, Phil the Meme, Socrates the Almighty Rat, Leo Morizaki, Shadow Lockhart, Herr Antares, Patrosator, Boomia1, Mr. Games Plays, Zave, Arwindai, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.